Last year, Claude de Baissac published a paper warning that South Africa had very little time to turn the economy around or face collapse in light of the ANC's recent loss of its national majority in the 2024 national election, and with the formation now underway of a government of national unity. I sat down with Claude to unpack how this unfolding political drama relates to his paper, and given what the President wrote in his weekly column on Monday about GNU partners agreeing to prioritise growth above all else, whether or not this was possible given the deep ideological divides between all the GNU parties. You're with the Monocle Banking Podcast, and this is our conversation. While the wrangle over power between partners in the Government of National Unity takes centre stage, President Cyril Ramaphosa has revealed the parties have at least agreed on priorities for the upcoming administration. At the top of the list of priorities is the achievement of rapid, inclusive and sustainable economic growth to create jobs. That was written in his weekly newsletter. As we know, the devil is in the detail when it comes to these things and how we achieve that. There's certainly been some volatility in the currency and the markets, with SA Inc. stocks about as tetchy as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs this week. Claude is the founder and CEO of economic consultancy Eunomix. Claude, welcome to the show. You have been, at times, a quite lonely voice, warning of the severity of our economic crisis in South Africa. Tell us a little bit more about your career so far.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for having me again. It's a very good question. I'm scratching my head and trying to find what is the best entry point. Let's just start with that paper you referred to. I think this is really perhaps the easiest way to formulate and for me to understand what I actually do, because it seems to continuously evolve as I grow into hopefully what will one day be a mature adult. And as the world evolves even more rapidly into this kind of organic chaos, my curiosity about how the world works and how human societies work and the relationship between time, space, and human activities, ideologies, policies, and structure and infrastructure. And that's very broad, but in retrospect, that's what I've always been pursuing. And so, and I've tried to reconcile what is in my family a very, very strong kind of dual character, which is one of great intellectual curiosity and dedication to research and science, and another one is a great passion for action and public action and a lot of soldiers and spies and resistance organizers and things like that. So I think it's just an innate non-Marxist praxis, right? The kind of social democratic, Christian democratic commitment to the common good through any way it means. And that kind of meant that I have to carve my own career, having tried many things, from wearing the uniform to thinking about being a lay minister in my early youth, to trying this political, economic geographer, social anthropologist, and doing all sorts of things in all sorts of places, including turning around state-owned airlines in Africa in the 2000s or failing to do so, to investigating organized crime in the Platinum Belt, literally with bodyguards, to doing these excruciatingly painful but extremely necessary in-depth analysis of what makes a country perform and not.
It's a fascinating description of a career that has seen you contract economist to the World Bank, as you say, turning around airlines, being a high school teacher, and now this economic consultancy that has developed a quite fierce reputation in South Africa for being frank, forthright, and not encumbered by a politically correct assessment or view of South Africa. And I think sometimes we are partial to that in South Africa. We are prone to looking for saviors and wanting to believe in narratives that will lift us out of our economic malaise, which I guess then brings us to that paper in which you warned of South Africa's impending economic collapse if swift actions weren't taken. Perhaps you can just remind us what that assessment of economic collapse was based on. And I know you've studied state fragility and what are the things that cause swift collapse. What were the key flashing lights in the cockpit of South Africa's national airline, so to speak, that were flashing and blinking to you that were indicating a potential crash?
Yeah. So look, I've been following and writing about South Africa for a long time because of the work I was doing in corporate crisis management and investigations for an American company called Kroll, which was essential in establishing the Scorpions way back when. And so I when I came to South Africa the first time in the early 2000s to work on these projects, there was a dissonance between what I was experiencing in the public sphere, this optimism, and what was clearly for me early on traces of a criminalization at the deepest level of state, which was not yet apparent to the population at large. But when you started digging deep, was very clear. And so started a long quest for understanding what was that dissonance about? Why was there appearance and the reality of a new functioning democracy on the one hand, with accelerating economic growth and inclusion, increasing inclusion, but on the other hand, there was this very disturbing background noise, of criminality and criminalization, including in state institutions that were still in the process of being transformed. And so it was trying to, because I'm never satisfied with the surface explanation of things. Well, it just happened, right? I had to go in depth and I had to try to find ways to describe this. And the first element that really it started really clicking when I started looking at the relationship between that which I was seeing and the crisis that was affecting the Thabo Mbeki administration around Zuma and the arms deal.
Mm.
And for me, that started making sense in the sense that there was a fundamental tension between what was happening in the public bureaucracy and sector and the politics of the ANC and what was happening in the economy. And that tension resulted, as we know, in Zuma becoming president. For everybody, or most of the people, that was a surprise and a catastrophe. For me, it was not a surprise. It made ultimate sense. So once I started having that theory of South Africa, it became a matter of being able to explain it through data, finding data that could actually explain what was going on. And that led to this massive amount of work on measuring state fragility in South Africa, and then developing a framework for doing the same at global level. It's no longer just about South Africa. So then by the late 2000s, mining companies I had been helping with these kind of issues kind of started asking me more structural questions. What does it mean? Where are we going? And I started developing, if you want, these parallel exercises, I would call them, right? The kind of data correlations experiments. And then I started really looking at the interplay between the economic and politics in South Africa, because there was clearly a dissonance between having worked on many and continuingly to work in many emerging markets. I could not understand. I mean, I could, but I could not explain in a sufficiently robust way the fact that Mbeki was kicked out by a populist alliance at a time South Africa's economic growth was at the highest. So he had economically delivered, and yet he had been kicked out by an unholy alliance of left-wing labor unionists and Communist Party and right-wing Zulu nationalists or African nationalists. It was astounding because it flew against all our theories and concepts of the relationship between development and policy in developmental state. So there was what was admittedly quite a market-friendly developmental state under Mandela and Mbeki that was actively being destroyed in the name of developmentalism by people whose program promised catastrophe and delivered catastrophe.
On that point, Claude, I mean, when we talk about the Zuma faction, if you want to call it that staged an internal coup d'etat in Polokwane in 2007. It's manifest now very much in the MK party, surprising many in its performance in this election. And it's a party that is openly and blatantly against the constitution, would much prefer to have a more tribalist type system in South Africa. But at its very base level, I think was laid bare by the Zondo Commission into state capture and how key state-owned enterprises and the ability to appoint service providers and award tenders via departments of state were repurposed to enrich a select few. So in that way, we had an effective criminalization of the South African state to serve a select few. They're now on
Well,
the
it already had
side,
happened,
though.
right?
Yeah, well, it
Yeah.
had
Well,
already
the
happened.
criminal, yeah, it had happened. I mean, the fascinating thing about the Zuma bet that Mbeki did against the Ramaphosa bet is that he placed a man who was extremely dangerous from the word go, because he had been head of counterintelligence of the ANC in exile and was inured, I mean, was based in the dark arts. And he had very, very cleverly started before being elected, right? The process of penetrating and the security apparatus. I mean, what people must understand is that this collapse of the state in South Africa very much started through a twin processes. One is cadre deployment from the bottom up, if you want, of people who don't necessarily or didn't have the necessary skills and certainly were not loyal to the state as much as they were loyal to the ANC. And that destroyed capacity, right? And it destroyed state autonomy, which is vital for development, administrative autonomy. And then you had, on the other hand, on the top side, you had this really corrupt security establishment, not all of which was attached to Zuma, but I mean, remember Jackie Salibi and
Yeah.
but these are people who had an ethos of survival and an ethos of counter-revolutionary and revolutionary activities. And none of that was addressed, right? It was just, we're going to merge the apartheid state and the democratic ANC state together, and we're just going to assume that it's going to work out just fine. The problem is that this is exactly the same dynamic that is at play now in this government of national unity. There is such a superficial understanding of these fundamental issues, right? And that drives this optimism and this kind of rejection of reality that you observe and you talk about the need for a savior. It's this magic thinking that seemed to be prevalent in the country, and where it's taken 20 years almost of policy disaster for the ANC to be sent to the minority, but it still commands 40% of the vote, albeit less if you count those who didn't vote, and these are significant.
Absolutely.
But this inability to really look at what's going on and to deal with it, because I suspect at the end of the day, South Africa is such a fragile assemblage of almost incompatible polities, right? I mean, it's not just the blacks and the whites and the Indians and the coloreds. It's much more layered than this, right? But people, I suspect, don't want to scratch too much because the complexity is scary. So we tell ourselves bedtime stories, and then we fall short, and then we ask ourselves why.
Yeah, well, let's scratch a little bit deeper then, because the market seems to have a view that mafia states, to coin what Venezuelan journalist and writer Moises Nam has described as a government actually becoming integral players, if not the leaders of criminal enterprises, that was very much associated with Jacob Zuma. And the battle, as it's been pitched in the public square, is one of an ANC of Cyril Ramaphosa's reform and renewal of that political organization and a pushing back against that mafia state of Jacob Zuma. And now, with the formation of a government of national unity underway, there is now a potential for us to basically push back against the criminalization of the South African state. Is that possible in an environment where so much patronage is still dispensed and so much of the political glue that holds the ANC together relies on doling out positions of power and allowing ministers to have fiefdoms where they can control huge budgets? I mean, if you look at the Gauteng province, for example, its budget alone, or its GDP, if you will, is bigger than any other SADC country. I mean, these are huge budgets that are attracting this kind of attention. Or does this GNU provide what you called the improbable window of opportunity that you mentioned in your paper for meaningful reform?
Well, let's just look back at Ramaphosa, right? So if your hypothesis, or if everybody's, or the majority's hypothesis is that Ramaphosa represents a good ANC and Zuma represented the bad ANC, and the bad ANC effectively created MK and represents, if you want, the manifestation of the failed takeover of KZN by the ANC. I mean, that was the promise of Jacob Zuma. That was the last frontier, okay, to get KZN fully on board, to stabilize democracy. And unfortunately, it's the opposite that happened. Kind of the KZN faction nationalists, represented by Zuma, for better or for worse, actually took the ANC hostage, right? It was a kind of a reverse takeover. So now that's been cleared out. So in a way, politically, it's very good, but it also manifests the failure of creating a single nation, unified nation. And it also begets the real political power of Ramaphosa. I mean, Zuma has been out of government now for 5 years. Growth, inclusive growth, reform. Wasn't that the new dawn? What's possibly stopped Ramaphosa from starting his economic policy reforms? And what stopped him from cleaning out the ANC? I mean, truly, and capacitating the National Prosecuting Authority when he became president? Nothing. So I have a very strong sense that this GNU is just a sleight of hand. It's the ANC trying at all costs to remain or recreate the broad church that it wants to be or pretends to be by sucking in opposition parties under the guise of a self-constructed national emergency. But there's no need for a GNU. And I think that the GNU is actually potentially far more deleterious to doing business than having a minority government who would propose to Parliament responsible, reasonable legislation and be accountable to it. So I don't buy it. Now, it doesn't mean that some reforms in some sectors and some aspects of the economy are not taking place, and they are.
Because I was going to say to you, Claude, I mean, I think many might point to Operation Vulindlela and the good work that has been done at a legislative level to enable reforms in the energy sector. We've had the ERA bill signed into an act. We've had an independent rail regulator and the enabling legislation for that drafted, and we're waiting for that to be enacted. I mean, these are very real reforms. This is not just talking about reform, and we're now sitting with 3 months without load shedding, and thanks largely to bringing in the private sector enabled by these reforms. Surely Operation Vulindlela, therefore, is evidence of a desire to break away from the past and to deliver on inclusive economic growth, as per the President's address this week.
Exactly. And therefore the indictment on the political class. Because, and this is something I said about 3 months ago at a World Bank conference on South Africa, I was listening to the self-congratulatory laundry list of achievements that prominent executive in the presidency was giving. And I was befuddled because at the end of I came in and I said, well, I mean, surely we can do it. Therefore, you can do it, right? If the political will is there, there are enough financial, technocratic resources to effect serious and successful, I'm not going to call them reforms. These aren't reforms. These are turnarounds. Reform is something else. Reform is changing the relationship between state, society, and the private sector, domestic and economic, and foreign markets. That hasn't taken place, and this is what reform is, and that's an entirely different conversation. What we have turnaround. But I then proceeded to say to that gentleman, who is a very nice guy and very competent, I said to him, so clearly, it's about political will, and therefore it's inexcusable that we have to wait for the utter collapse of the most fundamental of infrastructure, life-saving, life-giving infrastructure, for it to entirely collapse, for this president to actually muster the political courage to do what is needed. So I don't take Operation Vulindlela as, I take it as a manifestation of the fact that South Africa can and has the resources to take its problems. But I also take it as an indictment, again, on the political class and frankly, on the business community too, and on the public sector, on the public servants who seem to be perfectly contented with watching collapse until we are on the brink of falling.
I saw it in company results this week in announcements where there are now 4 days worth of potable water supply solutions in the forms of JoJo tanks and others being installed at various key infrastructure, because our water infrastructure has reached that critical collapse point that you mentioned, that it needs to reach before the requisite political will is mustered. And it can be mustered, to your point, and I'll certainly take that on board as a demonstration that we haven't had the political will. Coming back to the Government of National Unity, though, and your skepticism around its ability to speed up those reforms. Looking at the way the
Well,
process has unfolded.
But hang on, but Michael, there is
yeah.
no government of national unity as we speak.
Well, yeah, the potential, I should say, government of
Yeah,
national unity.
I mean, everybody talks about it as if it's a done deal, and this is symptomatic again, right? We sit around a table. I mean, at this point, it's an agreement to agree, and we can't even agree on key clauses of what the agreement is about.
Well, on that
I mean,
point,
geez, how did we get there?
Clause 16 seems to be the sticking one, where the DA was offered 6 ministers at the weekend and not just 3, as some reports have been claiming. And it's a misreading of Clause 16. The government of national unity shall be constituted in a manner that reflects genuine inclusiveness of political parties that are party to the statement of intent and are represented in the National Assembly, broadly taking into account the number of seats parties have in the National Assembly and the need to advance the national interest. The President shall, in consulting the executives, take into account the electoral outcomes. And then Clause 17 says that it's still the President's prerogative to appoint members of the executive. Given this, do you think the ANC has outmaneuvered the DA in neutralizing its high demands by bringing in many of the smaller parties into the GNU and now controlling the process? And then they can say they invited everyone.
Yeah, I mean, the ANC is a political machine. These guys are good. From a political standpoint, they're street fighters. They've been doing this their whole life. That's what they live on. That's what they breathe. That's what they sleep. That's what they dream. It's all about power. It's not about governing, right? So it's intricate, it's clever, it's witty, and it clearly has outplayed a DA, which frankly considers itself far more intelligent than it really collectively is. I mean, how do you sign something like this without having settled on the composition of the cabinet and on the policies and the policy direction? Is befuddling to me. And I must tell you that I was talking to a number of senior DA people while it was happening. And I said to them, look, as a friend of you, not necessarily a friend of the DA, but as a friend of you, I really recommend strongly that you change your tack and you don't agree to anything until it's signed and on paper. And this is where something just seemed to me to have gone terribly wrong. And if you know who the ANC is, and if you know what the stakes are, then you will take the time that is made available to you by the Constitution to keep your cards close and to play the game tight until the very end. Take it to the brink. And I've said that to them, take it to the brink. And look, and I'll say the same to the ANC, take it to the brink. Except that I don't like what the ANC has done to South Africa. So I would rather see a DA have a greater governing responsibility than the ANC, because they do a better job, even if I don't like their policies and I don't like their politics and I don't like their attitude. The fact of the matter is that the Constitution is very explicit there. There is a number of days that are available before the first sitting of Parliament, right? So I think it's 10 days, right? Calendar days. But that doesn't mean, and then the order of business, the Constitution is clear, but it's clearly loose enough to allow for contingencies.
Just to elect the president.
Then it says, no. I mean, my reading is very different from that, is that, so the first order of business, once the member of parliaments have been sworn in, is you have to elect a speaker. Right? And you have to elect a parliament. And it's not clear which one comes first, but obviously you need a speaker to run parliament. My understanding is that you have 30 days then from the first sitting of parliament to elect a president. Oh. Why rush into electing a president is what I question my DA personal friends. I said, well, why? And the answer was, well, because we have to, because, the future of the country is at stake. And I said, no, the future of the country is not at stake over 2 days or 3 days or 30 days. Never waste a good crisis, right? To do the right thing. And knowing the ANC, I mean, here they are. I mean, I was expecting the DA would get the speakership, right? I mean, that would have been proper. So I say to them, I said, hang on a second, I don't quite get it. You guys are so good, yet you've elected a president from an opposition party who was your sworn enemy until yesterday. You have given away the speakership. You have given away the crown jewel of provinces, which is Gauteng. You obviously have no play in KZN because you are a small minority party there. And all you got in all of this is deputy speakership. I mean, come on, this is funny.
Yeah.
And they're not amused, but they will find many ways to justify this. The fact of the matter is that yes, they have been outmaneuvered and outplayed by the ANC, and now the ANC is bringing everybody on board, and the ANC now is simply saying, we dare you to the DA, and we dare you to put an end to this GNU negotiation because you're having tantrums about ministries. Well, then, that horse is bolted, right? So now it's not the number of ministers that matter, it's the power of those ministers. So the battle for the DA needs to shift to really, okay, so we're going to have 6 ministries, fine.
Then we want our
but
own
these
DGs and DDGs, which
Yeah,
raises,
exactly.
Claude, which raises another interesting dilemma or irony, because the DA would then be accused of its own version of cadre deployment.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the DA has always done cadre deployment, and this is something that Guise has repeatedly pointed out, and that's true. Because, so once you start really viewing South Africa as this neo-tribal ensemble, then cadre deployment is something that the nationalists did. It's something that the British colonialists did, right? You bring your entire state with you. There's no state in South Africa. There never was a state, okay? It's not as if South Africa was a constituted nation state that was invaded by the Dutch or by the English or by the Zulus or by the Boers, the Afrikaners. It's a space where proto-states of different nature have contested and encountered and fought and collaborated and betrayed for survival and control. And in a way, and as I say that, it's kind of coming to me that this is what it's always been about, this battle for control of the monopoly of force that allows you to control the resources, whether it's land, water, gold, diamonds, people.
Well, it's explicitly stated in the strategy and tactics documents of the ANC under even Thabo Mbeki, and enunciated in the form of the National Democratic Revolution, that the ANC wanted to control all levers of state power in order to advance the so-called NDR. Just to end off, Claude, and I've got to have you back on the show because this is evolving rapidly and there's so much more to discuss, but back to your paper last year, which at the time suggested something as bold as a class action lawsuit against the ANC to hold it accountable for the economic destruction that it's wrought on the South African economy. With the GNU's formation, how can the private sector play a more active role in ensuring accountability and driving the economy out of the ditch that the ANC has driven it into? Is there a risk that the GNU's collaborative nature might dilute the necessary tough decisions and actions?
Oh, it completely will dilute those. And I suspect, this is Ramaphosa's plan, and it plays to who he is. I mean, he is truly a Lekotla, big house, big tent. Let them have him, let them be inside pissing out and outside the tent pissing in. And that by necessity will dilute decision making. I suspect that we are in for a very rough ride because we're going to have a very weak parliament. At least, we had a not very effective, but at least a relatively constructive opposition in the DA. Now we're going to have EFF and MK as clowns in the house who don't know the rules of parliament and are incapable of playing that game. And we're going to have this undigestible puree, again, I use that word very often because that's what it is, of people and different level of competences. Everybody needs to be accommodated. Incompetent ministers, Gayton Mackenzie, it's fascinating. He said, we're here for power, right?
At least he was honest.
Signing autograph. He's honest, but everybody is in it for power and for money. So you're going to have to let a sufficient critical number of people eat, as we say in South Africa, i.e. be corrupt, so that they stay in the GNU. And that is going to dilute the capacity of the state to grow. So I don't see a fundamental change in the equation. I see a chaotic government where we have replaced internal battles that were never resolved between the left, the right, and the center of the ANC by even more noisy, because they're not part of the same party, so it will be in the public, continuous battle about everything from who got the pen and who got the drive, the BMW, and too many blue light brigades and not enough, and no too much cutting of cost here and not enough there. I think it's going to be a show, frankly. It already is, and it hasn't even started.
And that wraps up this week's episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast. Certainly no bovine excrement, with Claude de Baissac, CEO of Eunomix and noted public policy expert. Before we go, just a reminder, you can find us on all good podcast platforms. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, don't forget to subscribe to the Monocle Banking Podcast.